Hi again, everyone. You join us again as we work our way through our series of studies I've entitled 66 Books. 66 short podcasts that take a brief overview of the 66 books of our Bible. And today you join us as we look at 1 Peter, the book of the salvation of the soul. First Peter has been called the Epistle of Living Hope. Some have even called it the Epistle of Suffering and the Job of the New Testament. 1 Peter chapter 1 verse 1 says that Peter wrote it. The similarities between 1 Peter and Peter's sermon recorded in Acts would suggest this also. Early church history as well as tradition also supports the view that Peter was the author. The book repeatedly mentions suffering, which is why many have concluded that 1 Peter was written after the outbreak of the persecution of Nero, which was in the autumn of 64 AD. Others, however, point out that there is no evidence in the epistle that the persecutions being referred to have yet resulted in martyrdom. Therefore, they conclude the letter was written on the eve of the outbreak of Nero's persecution. Therefore, the date is late 63 or early 64 AD. 1 Peter chapter 1 verse 1 says, "To the pilgrims of the dispersion." There is an instruction given that the recipients should keep their behavior excellent among the Gentiles. That's chapter 2 verse 12. And this would give the impression that the readers were Jewish Christians. Yet the content of the letter indicates that they were Gentiles also. Both conclusions are probably right. Jewish and Gentile believers lived in Asia Minor in regions not focused on in the book of Acts, but other historical documents talk about communities of Greek and Gentile believers in places like Pontus, Cappadocia, and Bithynia. The background of the letter was the growing news of opposition to the Christian faith. Believers were being slandered and attacked because of their faith. We know that from 1 Peter 4:14 and 15. They were hated because of their withdrawal from societal practices that they saw as sinful, like the sacrificing to the emperor. Because of this, charges of disloyalty to the state were made against them. Peter calls these things fiery trials in Peter 4 verse 12. The message of the book is quite simply the salvation of the soul. 1 Peter chapter 1 verse 9 says so. The message is that believers save themselves from spiritual damage by living a holy, loving, and submissive serving life, even in the midst of any suffering. So the structure of the book. Well, 1 Peter is the form of a letter. It begins with a standard salutation, a greeting, followed by a thanksgiving, after which there is the body of the book, and then it closes with personal greetings and a closing benediction. The first purpose of 1 Peter is to encourage those original readers that he had written to. Peter says he wrote to exhort and to testify. We know that from 1 Peter 5 verse 12. The book offers quite detailed prescriptive advice. In fact, 34 requirements are given in the book. Peter encourages believers to holiness, to love, to growth, to submission, to service. And all of these things he summarizes as the fruits of our salvation in chapter 1 verse 9, or simply benefits of the grace of God in 1 Peter 5 verse 12. The second purpose of 1 Peter is to testify. He is urging his readers to stand fast in their faith. And by doing so, his testimony is that this is a reality of what we must do when living in the true grace of God. They were facing and would face in the future persecution, suffering, and even those fiery trials I mentioned earlier. Such pressure, no doubt, would tempt many to doubt. Faint-heartedness would creep in, and perhaps even failure or falling away. Peter wants to assure them that they are right with God in spite of the opposition they might be experiencing. So in summary, Peter wrote this book to Jewish and Gentile Christians to testify concerning the true grace of God and to encourage them to save themselves from a life lived following worldly lusts by submitting to the will of God, even in the face of suffering. Believers will save themselves from spiritual damage by living a holy life, a loving life, and by submitting to God and continuing to serve Him even in the midst of the most difficult trials and sufferings.